Kia ora koutou katoa. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you're all well. My name is Taranish Singh. I'll be a host for this session. I lead BDO's risk advisory practice, which covers a broad range of services, but simply put, we help businesses to identify and respond to their challenges. This could be at a strategic level by reviewing governance processes against best practice, or by designing and implementing a risk management and reporting framework. At an operational level, we might help by redesigning a key process such as revenue or procurement, or simply by providing the board with comfort that the business is compliant with a key piece of legislation, a contract, or a policy. I'm very glad to be joined by Jarod Kerr, Chief Economist at Kiwibank, and Nick Davies, CFO at Whakarongorau Aotearoa. Together, we'll share some of our views on risk, both in terms of what to expect and how to respond, something that's particularly topical now and has been since the onset of the pandemic. Before we tackle today's topic, I'll quickly cover off a few housekeeping matters. All attendees are on mute for the duration of the session. If you have any questions or comments, can I encourage you to post them in the Q&A panel. We're keen to get as much interaction as possible today, and you can access the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The presentation should last for about 40 minutes. Thereafter, Jarod, Nick and I will run through a selection of your questions and provide our thoughts. And finally, this webinar, as with others in the series, is being recorded and will be uploaded to the BDO website shortly after the session this morning. Please feel free to share the recording with your colleagues and contacts. I should also mention that being in level 3 in Auckland, we're all running the session from home, working remotely, so we're not expecting any technical difficulties, but if we do have some, please bear with us as we quickly get through those. In a moment, I'll kick things off by sharing a few key insights coming out of our latest BDO risk survey. This centres on the challenges thrown up by the pandemic, how businesses have responded thus far, and the lessons that we can take from those responses. Jarod will then provide us with his economic update, which speaks directly to this year's top risk. And we'll then get a client perspective from Nick by discussing some of the ways in which Whakarongorau has responded over the past 18 months, including just how it's adjusted its approach to risk management. We'll then wrap up the session with some of your questions. As you can see on screen, in terms of the survey, our global risk landscape survey is something that we've run annually for the past 6 years. As with past years, we surveyed 500 C-suite execs from across the geographies, sectors and business sizes to identify what they perceive to be their top risks in 2021. The difference this year was that we also focused heavily on just how these leaders have responded to the pandemic and the outcome of those responses, so that we can all collectively take their lessons forward. I should add that these are just a few of the high-level insights from the report. I encourage you all to download a copy of the full report, as well as our New Zealand-centric white paper titled Scaling Uncertainty. This second document really focuses on the New Zealand context as distinct from the global situation. Both documents are available on our website as a one-click download. The report starts by setting the tone and introducing a concept from game theory, the wicked problem. This is defined as a challenge that's hard to complete because of incomplete, contradictory or changing information, and where there may not be a right or wrong solution. I think this term perfectly captures the last 12 to 18 months in business, uncertainty on an unprecedented scale. Unsurprisingly, it's this global uncertainty and disruption that is the common thread across all businesses. Some responded well, others less so. We found that decision paralysis, the inability or unwillingness to make a decision, was a key differentiator between winners and losers. 1 in 4 respondents identified that they had reacted too slowly at the onset of the pandemic. 60% reported uncertainty or a lack of clarity as the reason. For these businesses, this was a conscious decision to act slowly. 25% stated that they ignored or failed to fully acknowledge the situation. And 25% flagged stubbornness as the driver. These businesses chose to proceed with unaltered pre-pandemic plans despite the unfolding situation. As for those that responded well, the common thread was an agile mindset. Businesses that adapted to the situation quickly, even without the full picture, proved more resilient. We found that these businesses were more likely to perform this way if they had developed what we call a risk-welcoming attitude. The data clearly shows that businesses' attitudes towards risk plays a central part in how they overcome challenges. 53% of respondents who self-identified as risk-welcoming reported that the fallout of the pandemic had been less significant or much less significant than they had expected in April of last year. Only 16% of risk-averse companies felt the same, and in fact, more than half of risk-averse businesses reported that the impact of the pandemic was worse than they had expected. This is the key takeaway for those wanting to prepare well for the wicked problems of tomorrow. Our data shows that family businesses took the most impact from the pandemic. Being risk welcoming essentially boils down to investing in formal structures for managing crisis situations and planning for possible contingencies for future challenges. While there's been some meaningful movement over this in the past year, there's still a significant lack of this across New Zealand businesses, particularly family businesses. The reasons are largely cultural. Our number 8 wire, she'll be right attitude has a lot to do with this. Formalized risk structures can be seen as worrying too much and planning for failure, when in reality, risk management is about planning for success in spite of failures that are outside our control. We found that 90% of respondents have or are in the process of re-evaluating their approach to risk management. While this might be true on the global stage, it does beg the question whether a majority of Kiwi businesses will do the same. And in reality, that might mean implementing something for the first time. The key message is that businesses of a certain size and complexity should have a structured approach to identifying, analysing, and responding to risk. This need not be overly complex, but it should be an integral part of decision-making across the business, not a separate and often isolated function. In terms of the key risks that were identified, we've presented these in 3 categories, being the top 3 most significant pressures directly caused by the pandemic, top 3 risks that businesses are least prepared for in 2021, and some of the other key challenges that are a little bit closer to home and facing Kiwi businesses today. I don't think that any of these will come as a huge surprise. In terms of the top 3 significant pressures directly caused by the pandemic, we have low employee satisfaction and well-being, and inadequate technology and or a lack of digital transformation in first and second spot. I think these 2 perfectly sum up the situation of working during the pandemic. For those that aren't able to work, particularly during lockdowns, it's really about making sure that they are supported to stay connected with the business, stay engaged and motivated, and connected with their teams. For those that are able to work, it's really about supporting them with the right technology to do what they need to do as efficiently as possible, and also to, I guess, something that's a little bit more overlooked, or at least initially, it's supporting them to effectively balance the work life, home life, and family life. These 3 things are always competing against each other, but particularly during lockdown situations, they're all stacked one on top of each other, all competing for the same amount of time. Number 3 is internal cultural issues. This is hard to really comment on a collective basis, but we do know from our results that a large portion of this is related to blame culture, and the report goes into much more detail about that. What it does indicate, though, is the need for really strong leadership, a really clear strategy driven by that leadership team, and having that strategy really founded on strong organisational values. In terms of the risks that businesses are least prepared for, economic slowdown and slow recovery is understandably the top risk, and that's for the 2nd year in a row now. We'll get some insights from Jarod on that in just a second. Damage to reputation and brand value has appeared on the list again, or at least on the top 3 again. This was the top risk in 2019 before the pandemic. Understandable, and I think in some way, shape or form, this should feature on most businesses' risk register, but needs to be tailored to their particular circumstances. And increasing competition rounds out the top 3. The last list we have here are some of those other issues that are certainly on the global stage, but may not have presented themselves as high up the list as we're experiencing here in New Zealand. I know from personal experience that these are some of the key issues that my clients are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and we know that we're seeing this across the economy. ESG risks, environmental, social, and governance risks, have really firmly planted themselves on the agenda, and businesses are really committed to actually taking meaningful action in this space. That could be from assessing their supply chains from a perspective of sustainability to their recruitment practices and how socially equitable those are. Labour and skill shortages. I think this is something that's evident and is a direct result of the borders being closed. Interestingly, I did note that just this morning the government's announced their plans to fast track or at least streamline a number of people on working visas who are in the country getting through residency. That's a treatment, not necessarily a cure. I don't think we'll have a cure until the borders do open and we reach some sort of normality, but a key risk and key issue that everyone's dealing with at the moment. And lastly, supply chain disruption. It's only this week that we've seen the fuel crisis in the UK play out and how that's bringing the country to a halt. And I'm sure on a personal level, whether in business or as a consumer, we've all experienced some sort of disruption and stock out over the past 12 to 18 months. I think that's a good place for me to pause and bring you in, Jarod. As we know, you can see on screen there, economic slowdown and slow recovery is the number one risk. Again, we spoke to you about this last year, and we're keen to get your views on what our economic recovery may look like. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me back. It's always a fascinating discussion, and I think it's good to run through these ideas every year. From my perspective, I think we're in a very good position. I think the New Zealand economy has performed particularly well over the last year, right smack bang into the middle of this lockdown. And we're going to see another contraction, but based on our internal data and what we're seeing, we're already experiencing quite a sharp bounce back out of this lockdown. So the New Zealand economy is performing particularly well. We had GDP growth of 2.8% in the last quarter, which is amazing. So our growth is over 17% in the last year from the depths of the pandemic last year. Inflation's running over 3%, and our unemployment rate is at 4%. It looks like it's going to head below 4%. So it looks like we're running at a decent potential. It looks like we're running at a state where the Reserve Bank is happy that its mandates of inflation and full employment are being met. And I think there's going to be some other challenges facing businesses in times ahead. Now, the first challenge is the most obvious and already spoken to, but the first challenge is COVID itself. When are we going to be able to open our borders? When are we going to be able to let workers in? When are we going to let students and tourists back into this lovely country? And of course, there's supply disruptions on top of all of this. How long will it take those to be ironed out? The biggest assumption we have to make as economists is, when will our borders reopen? And if you look at this first chart here, it's pretty hard to tell. COVID is still a problem globally. You see, we've had 3 quite significant waves of outbreaks around the world, but there's been one really positive development in the last year, and that is the green number at the bottom. So although we've had 230 odd million cases of COVID, which is I think a number which excludes probably half of what's actually happened, and we've had close to 5 million deaths. Again, it's a number which I think is low. The bottom number there, that's 6 billion doses of vaccines globally. That's the turning point. We're at the turning point in this pandemic. So when we sit here as economists and try and figure out, well, what assumptions we need to make, where we're going to get to, we need to make an assumption on when the borders open up, when we get vaccine passports, when we go back to something a little more normal than what we've got today. And our assumption, no different to New Zealand Treasury or the RBNZ or other major forecasters in New Zealand, is that it's not going to happen until around the middle of next year. We might be in a position where we can open up back with Australia a little earlier, but to be honest, until we've vaccinated enough people in New Zealand, until we're comfortable with the usage of vaccine passports and other things, it's at least 6 to 9 months away, in my opinion. And that's a big assumption that we have to make, because from there, we're going to see two things. We're going to see Kiwis leaving, and we're going to see a whole lot of migrants wanting to come in. And I think the net result of that is that we're going to have a net migration intake going back to about the long-term average, which is 30,000 people per year inflow. But for now, we're in this really interesting experiment where we've shut out workers, students, travellers, and we've locked in Kiwis. How that exactly plays out, we're not sure, but like I said, I think once we start opening the door up, we'll see more Kiwis leaving, but a lot more tourists and foreign workers coming back in. And that'll give us a boost in growth, hopefully into 2023 and beyond. But in order to get there, you've all heard day in, day out about the need for us to get vaccinated. Well, let's just have a quick look at what happens overseas. Now, we've seen a lot of vaccinations taking place, but I just want to use the US and maybe a couple of other countries as examples. It's really easy vaccinating the first 50% of your population. They want to turn up for a jab. They want to get it vaccinated. It's much more difficult vaccinating the second 50%, particularly that last 30%. You'll see on the chart on the bottom right there, there's only a handful of countries who are above 80%. So the Maldives is the only country in the world that has 100% vaccination. They managed to line up all 10 of their members and vaccinated them. So it wasn't that hard. But for larger countries, it seriously becomes a problem. And if you look at the US chart, top right there, the first 50% was really easy to vaccinate. They were doing 4 million doses a day. Today, they're only managing to do 700,000 doses a day. 4 million doses a day at the peak, 700,000 today, and they've still got 40% of their population to vaccinate. Now, I say the US is one of the worst case scenarios, but we are going to face similar problems here in New Zealand as we try to get towards that 90% target. Now, the good news in all of this, and I think I showed this chart last time, is the fiscal response. And I can't underestimate this enough. It's really easy for governments to spray money around in a health pandemic, a health crisis. And that money that gets spent really does, it's like the fire starter for the economy. This is all supported by central bank asset purchases and keeping interest rates really low. But the governments that have spent the most have the economies that have performed the best. And the green economies on this chart, the ones that have spent the most, if you look at their economic performance, they have outperformed any other country that hasn't sprayed government funding in this time of crisis. And we are lucky. We're in a position where we are one of the haves, not the have-nots. And we've got a government which is providing wage support, wage subsidies, and a raft of other measures, including increasing infrastructure spending at a time when we desperately need it. So our fiscal response, which is being matched by monetary policy as well, slashing interest rates and printing money, has enabled a really strong rebound in growth over the last year. And this is not a New Zealand story. We're just part of it. This chart here I find fascinating. I've been running this chart for years. If you want to figure out whether equity markets are going to go up or down, you forecast global growth. You forecast, in this example here, world industrial production. On the chart on the left there, the dark green bar shows global output, and obviously fell quite sharply last year and bounced back massively with all the fiscal support. At that point then, the good fund managers in this world realized this is the bottom in the equity market. This is the bottom. This is the time to buy. As soon as you see the economic fundamentals take off the way they did, equity markets, interest rate markets followed suit. And what we have seen on that chart on the right there is equity markets globally have doubled in the last year and a bit. So since the worst of the crisis last year, global equity markets have doubled, which is a phenomenal effort. And it had you ignored the dip, and it had you just carried on without that dip, we're still up 50%, which is huge. So the amount of money being pumped into economies via governments and central banks is fueling financial markets. And as a little Kiwi economist at the edge of the world, why is that important for us? Well, we are a tiny little economy at the edge of the world with a massive export sector. So what goes on globally has a big impact on our tiny economy. And it's showing up here. You see, our terms of trade, which is our export prices over our import prices, is at record levels. That chart on the left, shows our terms of trade going back to 1861. We have never had a terms of trade this strong. Our purchasing power as a country is at record highs. We are receiving fantastic prices on our exports. And even though our import prices are increasing with supply chain issues, they're not increasing enough to decouple the relationship. So Fonterra's payout of $8 per kilo of milk solids for this year, that's the second highest on record. Timber prices, meat prices, seafood, you name it, we're getting very high prices for our product. That is an income boost to a small economy like ours. And the chart on the right there just highlights another risk that I'd want small businesses to be aware of. I believe the New Zealand dollar is undervalued. When you look at the New Zealand dollar based on fundamentals, like against the terms of trade or interest rate differentials, or just how our economy is performing relative to others, our currency is undervalued. So if you are an exporter, I'm saying to you, expect a currency that will grind higher, probably towards 75 cents against the US dollar. If you're an importer, well, this is good news for you. A higher currency means your purchasing power, which is being displayed here with the terms of trade, means you'll be able to buy more with every Kiwi dollar that you have. So that's one key risk, depending on where you are on that spectrum. Now, looking at what we're going through now, as an economist, we've got to forecast all this madness that we're in. And it's a lot of fun, to be fair. We had the great COVID collapse of last year where we dropped and bounced right back. And we're going to see the same thing again. This current lockdown that Auckland's in is going to cause about a 7% contraction in our economy, which is massive. Not as bad as the previous contraction we saw last year of 11%, but pretty bad nonetheless. Once we get into level 2, hopefully next week, hopefully, we will see all these indicators bouncing back very quickly. There's a lot of pent-up demand here, trust me. Rather than shaving my own head, I would love to go out and get an actual haircut. We will see the fourth quarter results bouncing back very strongly, and we'll be on a path which has got great momentum. So I'm not too worried about this current lockdown. 7% fall, 8.5% bounce back, and then we start continuing along close to the previous trend that we were on. The difference between those two lines, the difference between the dotted green line and the actual hard line, is the economic scarring that we've had because of COVID. The businesses that have gone bust, the output that we have lost, it'll take years to get that back. But compared to most countries, New Zealand is in a very good, very fortunate position. Now, I think one of the silver linings in the current situation is that firms, businesses are being forced to invest more. Whether it's they're unable to find staff, whether they are trying to compete into new markets, or whether they're just moving online and adapting to the current situation. What we have seen is investment intentions in New Zealand spike, and that is exactly what you want to see. Normally, in a highly uncertain environment, investment intentions evaporates and actually starts falling because businesses don't know what to do. In this case, businesses are responding with plans and knowing what they want to do to get ahead over the next year or so. That is probably one of the best charts in the whole pack, because this has been what has largely been missing since the 2008 crisis. And what's driving it? Well, when I speak to our Kiwibank customers across the country, the first thing they say to me, pretty much the first thing they say to me, is it's really hard to find workers. This experiment that we're running with the borders closed and I'm unable to get foreign workers coming in, that's killing my business. You know, I can't get the workers that I need. So this here is what I think is driving a push into more automation, a push into more machinery to try and get around the fact that there are a huge shortage of workers around the country. And that is also reflected in our unemployment rate, which is at 4%. That's pretty much full employment. And it really is across the country. You see, just this time last year, that New Zealand map at the bottom there, the blue, there was a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, and just about the whole of New Zealand came back saying, this is not good, we don't know what to do. Now, precisely 1 year on, the whole country is in flames, and the whole country is battling up against capacity constraints, have housing prices 30% up on the year, can't find workers, they're running too hot at the moment, which is the complete reverse. This map looks more like a climate change map than anything else, but it does show just how heated our economy is, and it's not just Auckland or Wellington or Christchurch, it's the whole country. is running hot, and most of that heat has been fueled by a housing market which is up over 30% in the last year, a staggering gain. And I'm happy to talk about housing in the Q&A. But that housing market in itself, we've seen a surge in supply, and the costs associated with building have also surged. We saw this before in 2003, 2005, and we're seeing it again. When you have a migration boom like we've had, and then you have a supply response, all the costs associated with building homes goes through the roof. Saw it in 2003, we're seeing it again. But that leads to a general point on inflation. We have inflation running at over 3%. It's probably going to spike to 4-5% near term. A lot of this is transitory stuff, but at the end of the day, the Reserve Bank is looking at their mandates. I have unemployment at 4% or fully employed pretty much, and I have inflation above our band, our target band of 1 to 3%. So as a central bank, you're looking at your two mandates, and the government's come along and said, well, actually, I also want you to smash housing at the same time. So you're looking at your 2.5 mandates, and it's pretty clear from their point of view that they need to hike interest rates. So when it comes to the risks, I think that businesses face, obviously everything around COVID, which will take a good year to play out, currency risk, the fact that the New Zealand dollar is undervalued, and the last risk is interest rates. Interest rates are rising and have quite some way to go. We will see an interest rate hike from the RBNZ next week. That will be the first of many moves from the central bank. We have a cash rate, which is 0.25%, and that is going to go up to 1.5% over the next year. So if you think about all lending rates out there, whether it's a home loan, whether it's a business loan, or whether it's a savings rate, all interest rates are rising and have at least 1% to go over the next year. So if you're a business with debt or currency exposure, there's two things for you to consider there, on top of all the other issues surrounding COVID, which I'm happy to go through in the Q&A, and I'm excited to answer your questions later on. I'll hand back over to Taranesh.
Thanks, Jarod. Very interesting, very insightful. I think there's some really good messages in there. There's a few things we need to be pretty mindful of and watch out for. The investment piece, the investment intentions, really good to see businesses actually investing and you know, moving forward, perhaps where we've lacked a little bit behind. Do you think it's enough? Are we just investing or plan to invest over the next 2 to 3 years to overcome the challenges of the last year and a half, or is it sufficient to overcome a potential gap that we've had for some time?
Yeah, excellent point. And I think that you've got to answer it in two ways. You've got to answer it from what the government's doing. So the government has underinvested in this country for the best part of 30 years, and that has also frustrated private investment. So what the government is doing is a step in the right direction, trying to take on this country's infrastructure deficit, which is massive. That really needs to be solved, and that is also part of our housing problem. On the other side, around businesses, I love saying it, and I say it all the time, we always underestimate the adaptability of business. You know, you throw problems at businesses and you'll hear about it, but then, you know, 3 months later they've dealt with it and they've moved on. And I think a lot of this is dealing with COVID. You know, I've been out in the regions. They're automating the best that they can. around, you know, in agri space. They're doing that. They are adapting, and what may have taken 5 to 10 years to do is basically being fast forwarded into a year. We're seeing it in banking, and we're seeing it in a lot of industries. This automation has been accelerated.
Good news, but I guess the key here is that we don't just play catch up on where we should have been today, but we actually continue that trend moving forward and don't become complacent again.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll call Nick in now, and we're going to get a bit of a perspective from him on how his organisation has handled the events of the last 18 months or so. But Jarod, we'll bring you back in a 10 or 12 minutes for some Q&A. Thank you. Nick, how are you? Thank you for joining us today.
Kia ora koutou, thank you for having me.
Look, I think a great place to start, you and I have known each other for a long time. I know that everyone on this call will know of at least a couple of the services that Whakarongorau provides, but they may not necessarily make that connection. Can you tell us just a little bit more and sort of set the context?
Yeah, sure. So, Whakarongorau Aotearoa, we're a social enterprise that has provided virtual health and social services since 2015. And look, our aim is to be there when face-to-face health and social services cannot. And we do that by providing free 24/7 clinically supported access for those in need, but also for people who are unable to access other options due to location, time of day, financial or cultural barriers. The organisation has interacted with more than 1.7 million New Zealanders in the past 12 months. And that's a result of operating many of the country's national telehealth services, including some brands that you might know: Healthline, 1737 and the Depression Helpline, Quitline, Gambling Helpline, the Safe to Talk Sexual Harm Helpline. We manage the screening registers for both bowel and cervical screening, and of course, more recently, the COVID information and COVID vaccination helplines. We've also played a role in supporting national crises such as this pandemic. We played a key role in the Christchurch terror attack support, measles outbreaks, and natural disasters, as well as the annual flu seasons. And just a little bit more around who we are inside the tent. So we've grown from 450 people in January 2020 to a team of around 2,500 people who are listening to New Zealanders' healthcare concerns and questions. And that's from Kaitaia to Bluff every day. We have our people based in contact centres in Auckland, Kaikoui, Rotorua, Wellington and Christchurch, and also from their homes across Aotearoa. And just in terms of some of our disciplines, so our services that we provide are supported by clinical teams of registered nurses, mental health nurses, psychologists, psychotherapists, counsellors, doctors, paramedics. We have poison officers, family sexual harm professionals and emergency triage nurses. And they are all part of a clinical governance group, which has very clear clinical triage protocols and processes to keep everybody safe.
Thanks, Nick. That's really insightful. And I mean, as I said, I've known you for a while, so I've seen particularly that change in headcount over the last less than 18 months, or a little over, sorry. But I mean, you and I were speaking almost weekly at that stage, and I couldn't keep up with your number increases week on week at that point. You know, more than most businesses at the outset of the pandemic, you had to make some fundamental strategic decisions very, very quickly. You know, not least for the health of the nation. And decision paralysis, which I mentioned earlier, just wasn't an option. You know, how did the organisation grapple with that challenge, and what were some of the learnings that came out of that?
Yeah, I think to an extent we had learnings from previous urgent responses. So again, just that Christchurch terror attack was a key example. We learned that there is a strong benefit from having a dedicated team in place who can quickly and I guess effectively respond to events on such scale, and that then allows the remainder of the organisation to operate the other services we had. So, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, a dedicated team was established. We took people from our existing frontline teams, clinical roles, as well as operational support. And their purpose was to focus on the organisation's response to this pandemic. And I think that allowed us to build the necessary capacity, capability, and also to manage risks specific to our response. And look, 18 months on, we are continuously planning, modelling and forecasting, so we have the right people and processes in place, and at the process in place, and I guess people available at the right times. And I think we also had to make a conscious decision. We had to quickly accept that the speed of things were changing, and we weren't going to get everything right first time, and we had to accept that 100% was no longer an option. So we had to make best efforts to use the information available to make decisions and to give tools to our teams, and we knew that as we gave those tools to our teams that it would likely change and evolve, and sometimes those changes were within a matter of hours. And also I think across the organisation, everyone's had to get comfortable with operating in the iterative world, and knowing that is okay, and that we all are part of that. I think we also knew that we couldn't do this all on our own, and we'd learned that partnering for capability, capacity, and community connections has been key to our ability to grow at pace and reach all corners of Aotearoa. And I think we stand pokahiwi ki pokahiwi, or shoulder to shoulder with other health providers, iwi, and local communities around the country. And in doing that partnering, that allows us to deliver services. We're being able to create workforce opportunities, and I think really importantly, we're able to make local connections to support language requirements and to meet local community and cultural needs.
That's great. I think the key thing that really jumps out at me there and what you said is it needs to be an iterative approach. What's become very clear through these experiences is that more often than not, particularly when we're talking in and around the challenges that COVID has thrown up, is you can't wait for 100% information. You can't wait for perfect clarity. We are talking about a spectrum here. There are situations where acting without full information is just not an option. But I think the lessons of the last year and a half are that when dealing with the pandemic, when dealing with businesses, people's livelihoods and our economy, we're much closer to the other end of the spectrum, where making a decision in many cases is more important than not making that decision and waiting for perfect information. We've seen also from this survey that many businesses chose to push forward with their pre-pandemic plans. Now, I am conscious that some of these messages are playing out on the global scale. We also heard from Jarod, who said that many businesses are in fact investing and adapting here at home in New Zealand. What are some of the lasting changes that Whakarongorau has made coming out of the learnings of the last 12 months or so?
Yeah, look, and we've definitely made some lasting changes that will that have changed how the organisation moves forward. I think, like so many, enabling our people to be able to work from home. We had a large contingent of our frontline team that worked from home before the pandemic, but that wasn't across all of our services, and particularly in mental health services. We quickly had to enable that so that we could continue to provide those services safely. I think we've made a lot of lasting changes with our technology infrastructure reliability and stabilization, and I think, you know, linking back to what I was saying earlier, you know, we've been able to achieve that through strengthening our relationships with technology providers. And again, linked to that, we've had to diversify our workforce to make sure that we can support all communities in the country. And I think partnering with what we refer to as partner call centres has been vital. And I see a world going forward where you know, partnering to provide other services will be part of our makeup for the future. I think also a lasting change will be our ability as an organisation to recognise when we need to bring in specialist capability to mitigate risk. And you know, I know one of the top 3 factors in the report was talking around reputational risk, and we recognised during the pandemic that we needed to bring you know, external expertise in to come and support us with that reputational risk, particularly as the organisation was cast more into the media spotlight. I think we've also some other lasting changes that we've made. We've fully virtualized our recruitment and onboarding processes. Today, our virtual solution is capable of onboarding 900 people per week, and that's to allow the organisation to support community outbreaks as we are in, and when we saw that sort of surge in volumes in mid-August. And I also like to think that we've built a change resilient workforce across the organisation. People are much more open and accepting to that change and able to understand why it's happening. And I think just finally, and I think important just to include is just talking around, we've developed far stronger lines of communication. So both the why internally, but also with our key stakeholders across the health sector.
Yeah, I think looking at that report as well, I'm sure something that really resonates with the organisation is that piece around making sure that your workforce remains connected, remains enabled, they have satisfaction from what they're doing, and their well-being is prioritised. You know, certainly in Auckland at the moment, all businesses are working remotely where they can, but you know, and we have done that regularly for the last 18 months. But given your organisation, given the scale of the number of people we're talking about, and just how many of those are based at home, and also given that some of the situations and topics that they deal with as well, it's vitally important that effort is actually put into that space. You and I have done a lot of work over the last year or so on reviewing how the organisation actually identifies and ultimately handles and mitigates risk. We made some changes to the approach that you've had in place since the organisation started in 2015. And what are some of the key takeaways that you have? You know, some practical insights, having been on the client end of that experience, and you know, what are some of the benefits? What were some of the challenges that you experienced from your perspective?
Well, lots of benefits. You'll be glad to hear. I think, you know, it allowed us to refocus the board and the management team to look at the category of risk rather than individual or operational situational risks. So that was a really important refocus for us. I think the reviewing of our appetite and tolerance to risk categories, it highlighted a lot of areas where we were willing to accept more risk, but also those risk areas that we needed to focus on more. And that's been particularly useful given how much the organisation has changed in the last 18 to 24 months. And I think, you know, one of the big takeaways for me was it really allowed us to reset how we talk about risk at the governance and the management level. And I think it has really allowed us to focus on what's at heart of the risk, and it cuts through some of the noise that can sometimes arise when an event or a situation presents itself. And look, and I think you know, I think a really important benefit here is that actually what we've created is it's a decision framework rather than just a risk register that we would periodically look at, and it really allows us to adjust our approach quickly and be able to flex some risk tolerances in the short term. That might be accepting more risk for a small number of weeks during a community outbreak, for example. And I think that ability to flex and that knowledge that it's accepted that we can flex is actually a vital outcome of this piece of work we did. And look, and I think Taranesh, I think in terms of challenges, it was the key challenge to working through this was agreeing definitions and descriptions between the management and board. And look, I think whilst to an extent that was time consuming, it did lead to really insightful discussions and debate at both management and governance level. And I think now that we are, those learnings mean that we are better at articulating risk, and so that we can quickly come together and work through them and understand what needs to happen to either seek out risk or to mitigate certain risks.
Yeah, it is a challenging area. I mean, I think a lot of people can look at implementing a framework, and on the face of it, I think that most people look at that and think that is a good idea, but where things fall down and that process falters is in and around how that is then supposed to be taken forward and how it's supposed to be used. I think too many people falsely look at this as an administrative burden or something that really, we do, it's part of good governance. But really the risk register is prepared and it's put onto file 13 and doesn't really get too much time. There is huge benefit that can come from this process, and that's only if risk management is integrated and becomes part of the decision-making framework of the business. Yes, challenges in defining, categorizing risk and even agreeing ratings, but what it is doing is making sure that these conversations are being had around the right tables. And while difficult to reach some sort of consistency, there is certainly always going to be an element of subjectivity. It allows a consistent framework so that, as far as possible, different personalities, different experiences, different points of view around the table can all work towards the same thing in the same direction. We'll move on to a few questions now, and I'll call Jarod back in. But I think to summarize and really just capture a lot of the conversations we've had here this morning, I think the best way to think about it is in terms of a few rhetorical questions for people to consider. This is about, have we reached a size and scale that actually warrants having a little bit more of a structured approach to risk management? And do we regularly consider risk when making important strategic decisions? Risk is, the word's got a bad reputation, but the reality of the situation is it's really just the other side of the strategy coin. We're human beings, we're naturally focused on the positive, and strategy and where we can get to and what we can achieve is something people enjoy talking about. But what could stop us from getting there and actually achieving that is something we naturally shy away from. For businesses that do have a risk framework in place, it's asking that question of, are we really using it? Is it actually delivering value? If we have a risk register, when did we last review that? Is it providing any value to us? And should we really be rethinking how we approach this and how risk forms part of the decision-making process? Moving on to some questions, I've just had a few of them forwarded on to me here. Jarod, here's one for you, which is, could you share a few comments on exposure to China in the current climate?
Yeah, very good question. One thing I would say is China is obviously our largest trading partner. One thing I've been saying for the best part of a decade is we need to diversify. We need to look at other areas in the Asian region. And there is one country that stands out to me as being the perfect substitute, and that's India. If we look at simple demographics, population growth, what's likely to happen in the next 10 years, India will go from being a country that was very poor, a few decades ago, to being the third largest country on the planet in 2030, and that's just the next 10 years. So I believe we need to focus on a free trade agreement with India, and we need to diversify the best we can. China, I think, is a very interesting case, and one that comes with significant political and military risk. And that's something that we're going to have to play very carefully. We're going to have to tread very carefully from here, where our brothers in arms, for lack of a better term, our very close Aussie cousins are already in the middle of a very heated geopolitical situation, and New Zealand's just next door. So I think it'll get worse before it gets better. But for me, it's about diversifying. Let's think of some other trading partners. Let's get up into the EU. Let's have a look at Africa. Let's have a look at other areas to make sure we've got more options out there. But I'm not a geopolitical sort of strategist, but it's pretty clear what's happening out there, and it worries me.
Yeah, it's that really just comes down to diversification, doesn't it? And
I think so.
China, there's a very clear and obvious reason why strong partnerships have developed over time, just for no other reason than the scale that affords. But as you say, India is a perfect substitute, and then there are plenty of other trading partners around the world and around the region as well. I'm conscious of time. I think what we'll do is we'll take 2 more questions. I appreciate that some people will need to drop off on the hour to attend other meetings, but we'll just go a couple more questions. We might run just a couple minutes over, and then we'll wrap things up. Nick, we've got a question here from Wayne. This is all about brand and reputation risk, something that you mentioned as key risks for, well, we mentioned as key risks for organizations, and you mentioned when speaking to me. The person mentions that they're aware that you've recently rebranded, and asked to what extent did risk management impact your decision making and around the strategy on that decision?
Yeah, you're right. So we rebranded at the start of this calendar year. But look, that had actually been in plan before the pandemic. But when that first wave hit us back in sort of February, March 2020, we made the decision that actually rebranding when we were trying to support so many New Zealanders wasn't going to be an exercise that would probably complement each other. So we waited for that. And look, what we're really doing there, the risk that we were really trying to look at around in terms of brand was connecting our services back to the communities. So we were known as Home Care Medical, and a lot of people sort of thought that meant as an organisation we were providing care inside people's homes, face to face. And so we actually wanted to really think about how do we represent an organisation that connected back into those communities. But you're right, there was a fair bit of work in there to just make sure that as we went through that rebrand process, we were protecting the reputation and how we were seen, either through the eyes of the public or our key stakeholders.
Thank you. Jarod, we've got a question here from Kim about GDP growth, and it's specifically on, are we seeing actual growth, or is this actually being driven by very high and still increasing levels of inflation, which are driving costs up?
Yeah, good question. Bit of both. We economists like to look at things in real terms, which means we strip out or try to strip out the inflation components. So when I say the New Zealand economy rose a rapid 2.8% in one quarter, that's real volumes growth. Nominal GDP rose even higher over the quarter. So yes, we do try and strip these things out to get a better handle on it, because as you rightly point out, we've seen quite a bit of inflation over the last year, particularly around the supply constraints. Shipping costs have gone through the roof. You know, oil is doing what oil is doing, and we're seeing quite a fair amount of inflationary pressure come through. The good news within that is that wages are responding. We've seen an 8% increase in hours paid over the last year. That is a good indication of nominal growth, and you know, we've got real growth doing good things. We've got inflation on top of that, but we've also seen that being pushed through into wages, which is what you would hope to see. That would be much worse if we'd seen this inflation spike and wages were growing at 2%. So yes, we do try and strip out inflation best we can. It is a problem. A lot of that inflation that you're seeing is hopefully what we call transitory. Hopefully it'll be over and done with in the next 6 months, but time will tell.
Indeed. Well, look, thank you very much. I think that's really the right place to wrap things up. Jarod, Nick, thank you very much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Very insightful, and I know that everyone on the webinar today got a lot out of the session, so thank you very much. Always a pleasure. For those of you still on the line, you can see that we've got another session in just under 3 weeks, episode 13, which is really focusing on the business landscape rethinking the business landscape to achieve growth and prosperity. That's a Wednesday, the 20th of October, same time. And we've got Brett O'Reilly, Chief Exec of EMA, Kirk Hope, Chief Exec of Business New Zealand, and David O'Connor, Chair of BDO, presenting that session. Please join us for that. And I trust everyone took something out of today and something did resonate. Please reach out. I'm happy to continue the conversation. And thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.